A quiet courthouse morning until one arrogant cop thinks he's above the law. When he arrests a calm, older black man without cause, he believes it'll be just another day, just another report, just another name he can forget. But what he doesn't know is he just put handcuffs on a retired federal judge. And that mistake, it's about to unravel everything. What follows is a storm of truth, humiliation, and justice served cold in front of everyone. You won't believe how fast the tables turn. So buckle up, because this isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call. Let us know where you're watching from and what time you're tuning in. Drop a comment below. We read every single one. It was just another quiet morning in Fredericksburg, Virginia. The kind of morning where the wind rustles the leaves like whispers from the past, and the bricks on the old sidewalks feel like they've memorized 100 years of footsteps. The town was waking up slow. The bakery had just flipped on its open sign. The post office door creaked open, and birds chirped over the low hum of traffic. But none of that mattered to Calvin R. Turner. Calvin wasn't out for coffee or errands. For him, this morning walk was ritual healing. He walked this same route every Tuesday and Thursday past the church with the white steeple along the courthouse lawn, down to the river and back. It was his way of staying connected to a town he had once served, and a country that hadn't always served him back. Tall, well-kept, with a head of silver hair and posture that still turned heads, Calvin moved with the kind of quiet dignity that made folks glance twice. He wore a tan trench coat over a button-down shirt, and he carried a leather briefcase, old, scratched, but cherished. No one would have guessed what was inside it, and no one would have guessed who he really was. Until it was too late. 2 blocks away, a police cruiser slowed as it turned onto Princess Anne Street. Officer Rick Hanley was driving. His partner Paul Drayton sat silent in the passenger seat, sipping gas station coffee. They weren't supposed to be patrolling this side of town, but Hanley liked to circle back through the historic district. His words, not policy. He said he was just looking out for loiterers. Everyone else knew it was code. Looking out usually meant hassling black residents who didn't look local. Hanley's eyes locked on Calvin like a hawk spotting movement in the brush. "Who's that?" he asked. Even though Calvin had walked this route for years, Drayton glanced but didn't answer. Hanley pulled the cruiser to the curb anyway. Something in his gut said Calvin looked out of place. Not because he was doing anything suspicious, he wasn't. Just because Hanley didn't recognize him. And in Hanley's world, that was enough. The cruiser's door swung open with a screech. Calvin slowed his walk as he heard the footsteps approaching. "Morning, Sir," Hanley said with that fake politeness that hides a threat underneath. "Mind telling me what you're doing in this area?" Calvin looked him square in the eye. "Just taking a walk," he replied calmly. "Is there a problem, officer?" Hanley's brow furrowed. The way Calvin carried himself, it rattled him. No fear, no fumbling. Just calm, direct answers that always made men like Hanley uncomfortable. He took a step closer. "Got ID on you?" "I do," Calvin said, pulling out his wallet slowly. "But may I ask what this is about?" Hanley snatched the ID, barely glancing at it. "You ask a lot of questions for someone walking in front of a courthouse," he muttered. "I believe that's still legal in this country," Calvin replied, voice steady. That did it. Hanley's temper flared, and in seconds he was barking orders. Hands on the wall. Now. Calvin blinked. "Excuse me? You heard me?" And before Calvin could respond, Hanley grabbed his arm, spun him around, and shoved him toward the red brick wall of the courthouse. The briefcase dropped to the ground with a hard thud. People nearby paused. A woman across the street stopped pushing her stroller. An older man getting out of his truck looked on, stunned. Calvin didn't resist, but he also didn't shrink. Even with his arms being yanked behind his back, he stood tall. "Is this really necessary?" Calvin asked quietly. Hanley gritted his teeth. "Keep talking, old man." Drayton stepped forward, looking uneasy. "Rick, maybe just—" "You want to join him?" Hanley snapped. Calvin's hands were cuffed tightly. The metal bit into his wrist. And just like that, a man who had served his country upheld the Constitution and handed down justice from a federal bench for over 30 years, was treated like a street criminal. And no one, not the bystanders, Not even his partner stopped it. Hanley grabbed the briefcase from the sidewalk, shook it like it might contain something dangerous, then tossed it into the cruiser. "Let's go," he barked, dragging Calvin toward the back seat. The woman across the street started filming. "You sure about this?" Drayton muttered as he opened the door. Hanley didn't answer. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white on the door frame. Calvin didn't say another word. Not then. Not when the door slammed shut behind him. Not when the cruiser pulled off, leaving behind nothing but silence and an empty stretch of sidewalk. He just stared out the window, his face unreadable, his eyes calm but not surprised, because he'd seen this before, and he knew something they didn't. They thought they'd arrested a stranger, but they had just arrested the wrong man. And in less than 24 hours, the truth would tear their world apart. The ride to the station was quiet. No sirens, no radio chatter, just the low hum of the engine and the thick silence inside the cruiser. Officer Hanley stared straight ahead, knuckles still tight on the wheel. Beside him, Drayton occasionally glanced at the rearview mirror, catching Calvin's reflection. Still calm, still composed. Not what he expected from a man who'd just been slammed against a wall and thrown into a police car for no reason. Calvin didn't speak. He didn't yell or plead. He just looked out the window like he'd seen this road before and knew exactly where it led. They pulled into the back lot of the precinct. Hanley yanked the door open, grabbed Calvin by the arm, and marched him inside like he'd just caught a career criminal. The front desk officer, a young woman named Rachel, looked up and blinked in surprise. "What's the charge?" she asked as Hanley pushed Calvin forward. "Loitering possible obstruction," Hanley snapped. Rachel raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. She just handed him the intake clipboard. Hanley scribbled without reading. Calvin stood still, hands still, cuffed face unreadable. "Name?" Rachel asked, glancing at Calvin. "Calvin Raymond Turner," he answered clearly. Something about the way he said it made her pause, like he expected her to recognize it. And maybe somewhere deep in her mind it did sound familiar. But she looked at the cuffs and assumed he couldn't be anyone important. Hanley handed over the briefcase. "Secure this," he said. "No idea what's in it." As Rachel took it, she noticed the initials CRT burned into the leather flap, faded but still proud. She set it aside gently, even as Hanley was already leading Calvin to holding. "Let's go, Your Majesty," Hanley muttered. Down the hallway, past rows of old wanted posters and bulletin boards with faded memos, Calvin walked with steady steps. He wasn't dragging his feet, wasn't protesting, just walking like he'd been in buildings like this 1,000 times before, because he had. Hanley opened the cell door, shoved Calvin inside, and locked it with a clank. The sound echoed. "You're lucky I'm not pressing assault," he muttered. Calvin looked at him calmly. "On who exactly?" Hanley didn't reply. He turned and left, muttering something about paperwork. Back at the front desk, Rachel quietly looked up the name. Something about this didn't sit right. Calvin R. Turner. It wasn't just familiar. It was on a plaque outside the federal courthouse downtown. She remembered passing it every day when she interned there in college. She opened a search tab and typed his name. There it was. Chief Federal Judge, Eastern District of Virginia, retired 2021. She stared at the screen, then back at the hallway where Calvin had disappeared. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Calvin sat on the bench, rubbing his wrist where the cuffs had bitten into his skin. He didn't feel anger, not yet. He felt disappointment, a quiet, heavy disappointment that sat deeper than rage ever could. After all these years, after service, after justice, after everything, this is what it still came to. His thoughts were interrupted by footsteps. Drayton approached the bars holding a cup of water. "I figured you'd want something to drink," he said. Calvin looked at him, then the cup. "Appreciate it," he replied, taking it gently. Drayton didn't walk away right away. "You've got a certain way about you," he said awkwardly. "Like, you've done more than what's on that ID." Calvin raised an eyebrow. Drayton shrugged. "I don't know, just a feeling." Calvin took a sip, then looked him square in the eye. "And what does your gut tell you about your partner?" Drayton hesitated. That he moves too fast, gets emotional. But he's been a cop 10 years. He thinks he knows what trouble looks like. "And you?" Calvin asked. "I don't know what I know anymore." Calvin nodded slowly. That's a start. Drayton looked down, then quietly walked away. In the report room, Hanley was laughing. Another one off the streets, he muttered to another officer. Guy thought he was a lawyer or some retired big shot. Was he, the other cop asked, only half interested. Hanley waved it off. Nah, just another smooth talker. Thinks if he wears a nice coat we'll let him slide. He chuckled again and went back to filling out the form, exaggerating everything. Resisted slightly, he wrote. Failed to comply. A few checkboxes. A quick signature. Done. He had no idea the biggest mistake of his career was already sealed in that paperwork. Back at the desk, Rachel took a deep breath and called over her supervisor, Lieutenant Harris. Sir, I think there's been a serious mistake, she said, showing him the search result. The man Officer Hanley just brought in, he's a retired federal judge. Not just any judge, the chief judge from the Eastern District. Harris stared at the screen, then looked up, alarm spreading across his face. Why wasn't this flagged earlier, he asked. No one ran a background check. Hanley said it was just loitering. Harris stood straight, lips tight. Get me Hanley now. Rachel nodded, but before she could move, Calvin's voice echoed down the hallway. You might want to check that file again before you embarrass yourselves further. His tone wasn't angry. It was calm, certain. And that certainty traveled through the building like a silent warning. Hanley emerged from the hallway just as Harris approached. Rick, we need to talk in my office right now. Everything okay? Hanley asked, but his voice had lost its bravado. Harris didn't answer, just turned and walked. Down in holding, Calvin stood, dusted off his coat, and looked around the cell. He'd been in many rooms like this in his life, but never on this side of the bars. And as strange as it felt to be here, one thing was certain. He wasn't staying long, because the truth was already unraveling. And when the courtroom doors opened tomorrow, it wasn't just going to be a hearing. It was going to be a reckoning, and the whole town would see who they had really put in handcuffs. They kept him there for hours. No phone call, no explanation. Just silence, steel bars, and the occasional buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Calvin sat on the cold concrete bench, his hands resting calmly on his knees, eyes focused but far away, like he wasn't looking at the walls around him, but through them, like he was watching time itself stretch and bend around the choices being made just a few feet away. Outside the cell, the precinct moved in slow motion. Officers coming and going, radios crackling, printers spitting out incident reports. Life continued on the surface, but tension was building, and everyone could feel it. Rachel, the desk officer, was pacing near the front. Lieutenant Harris was reviewing files in his office, his brows furrowed deeper with every page. And Officer Drayton. He hadn't said a word since his awkward conversation with Calvin earlier. He just stood near the locker room, arms crossed, jaw tight, pretending to scroll his phone. But Officer Rick Hanley was still talking, still laughing, still oblivious. Down in the report room, he leaned back in his chair, boots kicked up, chatting with a young rookie about how you spot trouble from a mile away. You see, Hanley said, tapping his temple, it's all about instinct. You walk these streets long enough, you just know who's clean and who's dirty. That guy this morning had that slick vibe. Something off. Carried himself like he owned the place. Did he resist, the rookie asked, half listening. Not really, Hanley said with a shrug. But you don't wait for them to fight back. You control the situation. Fast. He didn't mention the way Calvin looked him in the eye. The way he never flinched. The calm that made Hanley feel like the smallest man in the room. That part he left out. Back in holding, Calvin shifted his weight and stood slowly. His knees cracked, remnants of years in courtrooms and war zones. He stretched gently, then turned toward the tiny mirror bolted to the wall. For a moment, he just stared at his reflection. Not out of vanity, out of habit. Judges learn to study people's faces, body language, expressions, and sometimes when no one's watching, they study themselves. He leaned in, slightly eyeing the red mark around his wrist where the cuffs had been too tight. He'd seen worse, but that wasn't the point. It was never about the pain. It was about the principle. And right now, principle was bleeding out somewhere between the badge and the silence. Just then, the door at the far end of the hallway creaked open. Footsteps. Not rushed. Not soft measured. Lieutenant Harris appeared holding a file folder in one hand, Calvin's briefcase in the other. He paused outside the cell. "Judge Turner," he said. Calvin turned slowly, meeting his eyes. "I reviewed your credentials," Harris continued, keeping his tone steady. "The information checks out. I also reviewed the arrest report, and we have a problem." Calvin gave a small, knowing nod. Yes, you do." Harris cleared his throat. "You'll be released immediately. No charges filed. Officer Hanley's actions are under internal review." "Internal review," Calvin repeated, as if tasting the words. "That's what you call it." Harris didn't answer. He opened the cell and stepped aside. Calvin walked out with quiet grace, not rushing, not showing any signs of weakness, just presence. He paused near Harris. "I don't want an apology," Calvin said. "I want accountability. There's a difference." Harris gave a curt nod. "Understood." Rachel had already brought the briefcase to the front desk. Calvin collected it with a light touch, his fingers tracing the worn leather handle. Then he looked around the station, slowly, deliberately. Every officer he passed looked down or looked away, except one. Drayton stood near the exit watching. Their eyes met again. Calvin walked past him without a word, but he didn't break eye contact, and for a brief moment something passed between them. Not forgiveness, but recognition, and maybe a challenge. Outside, the sun was lower in the sky. Late afternoon shadows stretched across the courthouse lawn. Calvin took a deep breath of the cool air, the scent of pine and brick dust mixing in the breeze. He adjusted his coat and walked down the steps with the same calm grace he had arrived with that morning. But everything had changed. At home that evening, he sat at the kitchen table, a hot cup of black tea steaming in front of him. His wife Dolores paced the living room behind him, fuming. "They threw you in a cell," she said, shaking her head. "In this town, after everything you've done for this country, for this state." Calvin didn't respond right away. "They didn't even let you call me," she added, voice rising. "I didn't want you to worry," he said gently. She stopped pacing. "You think I wouldn't find out? The town's already talking." "I know," Calvin said quietly. "That's exactly what I wanted." She blinked. "You wanted this?" He turned to her, eyes clear. "No, but if it had to happen, I wanted it to happen here, where it matters, where people will see." Dolores stared at him, then sat across the table, taking his hand in hers. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He thought for a long moment. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm going back. Back to the courthouse." "You're not on the bench anymore, Cal." "I don't need a bench," he replied. "Just my voice, my name, and the truth." She didn't argue. She knew him too well, knew when his mind was made, and she also knew when Calvin R. Turner chose to speak, people listened. He rose from his chair and walked to the bookshelf, pulling down a thick leather-bound volume, the Federal Code. He opened it, flipped to a dog-eared page, and stared at the words like they were an old hymn. This wasn't about revenge. It was about something far older than that. It was about justice, real justice. And by morning, a courtroom would be filled with people who thought they knew what power looked like. They were about to learn. The next morning came quietly, but the tension in the air was louder than any alarm clock. The courthouse sat still under the rising Virginia sun, its white columns casting long shadows across the front lawn. The air was crisp, too crisp, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Inside the precinct, things weren't much better. The usual noise, the shuffle of boots, the static from police radios, the bitter aroma of burnt coffee was muted, almost hesitant. The buzz of gossip had turned into something more serious, more cautious. Word had spread. The man they arrested yesterday, the calm older black man in the trench coat, wasn't some nobody. He was Calvin R. Turner, a retired chief federal judge. Not just a man with influence, a man who had helped write the book on law and justice in that state, and they had cuffed him, thrown him in a cell without cause. Some were angry, others were nervous, but no one said it out loud. Officer Drayton sat at his desk, staring blankly at his laptop. The arrest report was still open. His cursor blinked next to a sentence Hanley had written. Subject was uncooperative and evasive. Drayton knew it was a lie. Calvin Turner had been the most composed person he'd ever encountered in an arrest, and that bothered him. He thought about it all night. The look in Calvin's eyes, the weight of his words, the way he didn't plead or argue, just stood there like someone who'd seen the inside of systems far more dangerous than two badge-heavy cops. And yet, he still got dragged down. Drayton stood up and walked down the hall toward the lieutenant's office, but Harris wasn't there. Word was he'd already left for the courthouse. Apparently, Judge Dupree wanted a private meeting before the hearing. That wasn't protocol. But none of this was. Back at the courthouse, Judge Marilyn Dupree stood at her office window, looking down at the sidewalk where Calvin had been arrested. She'd lived in Fredericksburg for 50 years, knew every street, every family name, every scandal that had passed through this courthouse. But this one had shaken something in her. She had met Calvin Turner once years ago at a state legal conference in Richmond. She was a newly appointed county judge. He was already a rising federal name. Even then, she remembered how people had leaned in when he spoke. He had that rare gravity, like every word he said mattered, and every silence mattered even more. She turned from the window when Lieutenant Harris entered. "He's on his way," she asked. "Yes, Your Honor. Judge Turner should be arriving within the hour." She nodded, and the officers involved. Holding Pattern Internal Affairs is reviewing everything. "There's tension. Let there be," she said, sitting down. "This town has spent decades pretending we're past certain things. Maybe it's time we admit we're not." Back at home, Calvin straightened the cuffs of his shirt. No tie, just a clean, dark gray suit, freshly pressed. His wife Dolores stood by the door, holding his briefcase. "You sure about this?" she asked again, quieter this time. Calvin took the briefcase gently from her hand and met her gaze. "I have to be." She nodded once, then stepped aside. He opened the door, and for a moment, just a moment, he paused on the porch. The light hit his face in full, and for all the years behind him, he looked like a man stepping into battle. Because that's what this was. Not a trial, not a hearing, a reckoning. As he walked toward the courthouse, something happened. People began to gather, not just out of curiosity, but out of awareness. Some had seen the footage from the woman filming across the street. Others had heard the name. A few remembered Calvin from when he used to speak at the local college, or from the headline when he retired. They didn't know the full story, but they knew enough. They knew this wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was about what happens when power forgets to ask questions, and justice remembers everything. Inside the courtroom, the tension was thick. Journalists had already started filling the benches. Legal clerks whispered near the door. Prosecutors straightened their files, unsure what today would bring. And then the doors opened. Calvin entered quietly alone, walking with the calm dignity of a man who had nothing to prove but everything to correct. Officer Hanley, standing at the far end of the room near the side exit, froze. For the first time since the arrest, his smile disappeared. He turned, slightly whispering something to a colleague, but his eyes never left Calvin's. Judge Dupree entered from chambers. The room rose. She gave a long look around the room, first at Calvin, then at the crowd, then back to the officers seated in the far row. "This court is in session," she said. Her voice was calm but sharp like a blade wrapped in velvet. And just like that, the game changed. Calvin took his seat at the defendant's table, not because he was guilty, but because that's where they had placed him. Judge Dupree leaned forward. "Before we proceed," she said, "I'd like to clarify something for the record." She looked directly at Calvin. "Mr. Turner, for transparency, would you kindly state your full name and former title for the court?" Calvin stood. "My name is Calvin Raymond Turner. I am the retired Chief Judge of the Federal District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia." A ripple moved through the courtroom. Small gasps, murmurs. One of the reporters dropped their pen. Hanley sat down, his face pale. Judge Dupree continued. "Let the record reflect that fact. This case is not only unusual, it is unacceptable." And just like that, the lie unraveled. Because from this moment on, it wasn't just about what happened on that street. It was about what had been ignored in every room after it. It was about what happens when a man carries himself with quiet dignity and the world mistakes it for weakness. They had put the wrong man in cuffs, and now everyone in that courtroom was about to learn who he really was. Silence hung in the courtroom like a held breath. No one moved. No one spoke. Not even the reporters dared to scratch their pens across paper. Judge Dupree's words had frozen the entire room in place. The reality of what had just been said echoed louder than any gavel could have. Retired Chief Federal Judge Calvin Raymond Turner. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't speculation. It was fact on the record under oath, and undeniable. And now everyone in that courtroom had to sit with it. Officer Hanley shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His face had gone from flushed red to a pale grayish white. The confidence he walked in with had drained out of him the moment Calvin said his name. His shoulders twitched, his fingers flexed. He looked like a man trying to make himself disappear. Too late. The prosecutor, a woman named Jennifer Sloan, leaned forward. She'd been quiet up to this point, but now her eyes were sharp scanning Calvin's record, which had just been handed to her by a panicked clerk. She'd heard whispers, of course, but now she saw it in print. 3 decades on the federal bench, commendations from 2 presidents, veteran civil rights contributor, speaker at law symposiums across the country, a man whose legal mind had helped shape statewide policy, and he had been thrown into a holding cell for walking near a courthouse. Judge Dupree cleared her throat and looked across the room. Before we proceed with any further discussion of this case, she said, we will allow Mr. Turner, Judge Turner, to make a statement. Calvin stood slowly. Not because he needed to, but because he believed in respecting the space. The courtroom. The truth. Even when others didn't. He walked to the center of the courtroom floor, his briefcase left behind on the table. His voice, when it came, was soft, but clear, unshakable. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of this court, I come before you today, not as a plaintiff, not as a judge, not as a victim, but as a citizen. One who has served this nation in uniform. One who has sworn to uphold the Constitution. One who still believes that the law is not just ink on paper, but a promise. He paused, not for drama, but to let the words land. That promise was broken yesterday. Not because of violence, not because of rage, but because of assumption. Because a man in a trench coat walking near a courthouse was seen as suspicious. Not because of what he did, but because of what he looked like. A murmur moved through the gallery. One woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. An older man seated near the back gave a slow, solemn nod. I have presided over thousands of cases. I've watched lives changed by a single sentence. I know the power this room holds, and I know the danger when that power forgets its responsibility. He turned slightly, his eyes locking with Hanley's. I do not want revenge. I do not wish harm on the men who arrested me, but I will not stand silent while injustice walks in uniform. Hanley looked down. Drayton, sitting a few seats away, didn't move. He just stared straight ahead, jaw locked, a thin vein pulsing in his temple. Calvin continued, this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been silenced, overlooked, or wrongly accused. People whose names didn't make the papers, who didn't get to stand in front of a room like this and speak. He looked back at Judge Dupree. So today I speak not just for myself, but for them. When he finished, he returned to his seat. No dramatic bow, no theatrical gesture, just the quiet dignity that had always defined him. Judge Dupree took a long breath. Her eyes, slightly misty, glanced down at the docket. Thank you, Judge Turner, she said softly. Your words speak to more than this courtroom. They speak to this community, and they will not go unheard. She turned toward the prosecution. Miss Sloan, would the state like to proceed? Jennifer Sloan stood adjusting her glasses. Your Honor, given the facts now made clear, the state moves to drop all charges immediately and enter an apology into the public record. Granted, Judge Dupree said firmly, banging the gavel once, let it be so entered. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't, because Calvin didn't just want freedom, he wanted truth, and Judge Dupree knew that. She turned to the bailiff. Please call the first witness, Edith Langley. There was a stir in the audience as a woman stood, late 60s, white hair pinned up neatly, a floral shawl draped over her shoulders. Edith Langley had lived in that town longer than most of the officers had been alive. She walked slowly but proudly to the stand. After being sworn in, she sat, looked directly at the jury box even though there wasn't one, and spoke in a clear voice. "I was there," she said. "I saw the whole thing." That man, she pointed at Calvin, was walking peacefully, hands in his pockets. Didn't look lost, didn't look threatening. Just looked like he belonged. She paused. Then the police car pulled up. The officer got out, started questioning him. Real aggressive. The other officer, he stayed quiet, didn't say a word. The man, Judge Turner, answered politely, calm. But that just seemed to make the officer angrier. Then he pushed him against the wall, cuffed him like he was a criminal. She turned to Judge Dupree. "I've lived in this town my whole life, Your Honor, and I've seen things, but this shamed me." There was no cross-examination. There was no need. Judge Dupree leaned back in her chair and said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Langley. That'll be all." As Edith stepped down, the courtroom felt different, heavier, more honest. Calvin watched her pass by, gave her a respectful nod. She returned it, then exited quietly like a ghost, finally getting to speak. And with that, the walls around the truth began to crack. Because sometimes justice doesn't need a verdict. Sometimes it just needs a voice. And in that courtroom, voices were finally rising. The room was no longer just a courtroom. It had become a mirror. Everything that had been hidden behind silence, behind uniforms, behind assumption, was now out in the open. The gallery didn't whisper anymore. They listened, fully, closely. The truth had arrived and no one could look away. Judge Dupree looked across the courtroom, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharper than ever. She turned to the prosecutor. "Miss Sloan," she said, "I believe there is more to uncover here. Before this hearing is concluded, I'd like to hear from the arresting officers." The words landed like a warning shot. Officer Hanley shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened. His shoulders tensed. This wasn't the outcome he expected. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had walked into this courtroom thinking he was the authority in the room. Now he looked like a man sitting in the middle of a firing line with no shield, no helmet, and no backup. Sloan stood. "Your Honor, the state calls Officer Richard Hanley to the stand." Hanley froze. His mouth parted like he might object, but then he caught Judge Dupree's gaze. That stare, the kind that makes you remember your mother's voice when you knew you'd crossed a line. He stood, adjusted his collar, and walked slowly toward the witness chair. The bailiff swore him in, and he sat down rigid as a board. Sloan stepped forward. Her tone was professional, but sharp. "Officer Hanley, describe for the court what made you approach Mr. Turner on the morning of his arrest." Hanley cleared his throat. The subject, Mr. Turner, was walking near the courthouse in a manner I deemed suspicious. "Suspend your jargon, officer. What does suspicious mean to you in this case?" Hanley hesitated. He didn't look familiar. He was standing near the courthouse steps, not doing anything, just lingering. Was he loitering? Hanley blinked. I believed he might be. Did he have any weapons? No. Was he yelling, acting erratically, disturbing the peace? No. Did he threaten you or your partner? No. Did he refuse to show ID when asked? No. Sloan let the final no hang in the air for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly and asked, "So what exactly did he do that warranted being cuffed and thrown into a holding cell for 6 hours without a single phone call?" Hanley opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because there was no answer. Not one that would stand up under oath. Not one that would make sense to anyone watching. He shifted again. I felt he was being evasive. By asking what the problem was, Sloan asked, "Yes." So a citizen calmly asking why he's being questioned is grounds for physical detainment. Hanley swallowed hard. I believed he was trying to provoke a confrontation. "Or was it you?" Sloan said, stepping closer. "Who escalated that confrontation?" Hanley didn't answer. Let the record show. Sloan continued that the subject complied with every request, provided ID, and never once resisted. And let the record also show, Officer Hanley, that you wrote in your report that he was non-compliant, a claim now publicly refuted by multiple witnesses. Video footage and your own testimony today. Judge Dupree gave Hanley a long, hard look. "You may step down." Hanley rose slowly. He didn't make eye contact with anyone as he returned to his seat. But Calvin watched him the entire way. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't angry. He was waiting. Because he knew what was coming next. Sloan turned back to the court. The state now calls Officer Paul Drayton. Drayton looked up, startled. His name hit him like a slap, but unlike Hanley, he didn't hesitate long. He stood, walked to the stand. His face was pale, but his walk was steady. He took the oath, sat down, kept his hands folded. Sloan approached him carefully. Officer Drayton, you were present at the scene of Mr. Turner's arrest. Yes. You observed everything. Yes. Did Mr. Turner act aggressively in any way? No. Did he resist arrest? No. Did you personally believe he was a threat? Drayton looked across the courtroom. His eyes met Calvin's for a brief moment. Then he looked back at Sloan. No, he said, I didn't. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Sloan kept her voice low. Then why didn't you intervene? Drayton's throat tightened. His words were slower now. Because I was afraid. Of Mr. Turner. No, he said quickly. Of what it would mean if I challenged my partner. Of the pushback of looking weak in front of the others. Sloan nodded. But you knew it was wrong. Drayton's voice dropped. Yes. A full silence returned to the room. It wasn't awkward. It was necessary. Drayton looked up. I've been a cop for 12 years. I've seen real danger. I've also seen men like Mr. Turner. Men who carry themselves with dignity and peace. I knew something was wrong the moment we put him in cuffs. Sloan took a step back. Thank you for your honesty. Judge Dupree studied him for a moment. You may return to your seat, officer. As Drayton stepped down, Calvin gave him the slightest nod acknowledgement. Not forgiveness, but a small, quiet offering of grace. Judge Dupree rested her hands on the bench. This court has now heard testimony from both officers. One attempted to justify the unjustifiable. The other admitted to silence in the face of it. And Judge Turner, though no longer seated on a bench, has reminded us what real authority looks like. She leaned forward slightly. Let the public record reflect that what occurred here is not merely a matter of misconduct. It is a breach of trust, a betrayal of oath. And while this court cannot undo the humiliation endured by Judge Turner, it can ensure that the truth remains etched in history. Calvin sat still, hands folded on the table in front of him. His face was calm. But behind that calm there was something else. Resolve. He had not come to destroy reputations. He had come to defend the idea that no one, not even a man in a robe, was above being dehumanized. But neither was anyone below being respected. And in this courtroom, for the first time in a long time, respect had returned. Not because it was demanded, because it was earned. The courtroom no longer felt like just a place for legal proceedings. It felt like something sacred now. Like the air inside had grown heavier with truth, too dense to ignore, too thick to deny. Everyone present could feel it, and none of them would leave unchanged. Judge Dupree folded her hands in front of her, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burning with quiet fury. She looked toward the gallery, then to the witness list, her voice even, but resolute. This court calls Edith Langley back to the stand for further testimony. There was a slight stir in the crowd as the elderly woman rose again. Edith walked slowly, but her steps had purpose. This wasn't just about repeating what she saw. It was about telling the whole truth now, without hesitation. After being sworn in again, Edith sat and adjusted her glasses. Ms. Langley, the judge began. You were present at the scene of Judge Turner's arrest. You've already described what you witnessed, but I ask now as a member of this community, what was your impression? Not just of the arrest, but of the officers involved. Edith looked around the courtroom. She didn't fumble or glance nervously like some witnesses do. She met the moment head-on. My impression, Your Honor, she said clearly, is that one of those men. Officer Hanley wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in control. He wasn't trying to understand who Judge Turner was. He didn't care. He saw an older black man walking near a courthouse and decided he didn't belong there. A low murmur moved through the crowd again. Judge Dupree gave the room a glance, and it quieted instantly. And Officer Drayton, the judge, asked. Edith hesitated only a moment. He looked afraid. I don't know of what. Maybe of his partner, maybe of the job. But he knew what was happening wasn't right. You could see it all over his face. Judge Dupree nodded slowly. Would you say this incident reflects a wider problem? Edith inhaled. Yes. Because it's not the first time I've lived here for 48 years. I've seen polite people get harassed, decent folks get doubted, and stories swept under the rug because they were inconvenient or uncomfortable. But this wasn't just a mistake. It was a message. The judge leaned in slightly. What message? That no matter how far we've come, we haven't come far enough. That even if you've worn the robe, carried the flag, built a life of honor, you can still be reduced to a suspect because of your skin. Those words lingered like smoke, like thunder after lightning. Judge Dupree's voice was soft but firm. Thank you, Ms. Langley. As Edith stepped down from the stand, something remarkable happened. The room didn't erupt in applause, it didn't cheer, it just stood one by one. People rose to their feet, not for drama, not for show, but for respect. Calvin didn't stand. He remained seated, eyes lowered. Not out of shame, but because he didn't need the recognition. This wasn't about ego. It was about endurance, about truth, about every man and woman who never got their day in court because no one believed they deserved one. Sloan, the prosecutor, approached the bench. Your Honor, the state calls no further witnesses. The facts have spoken louder than any argument we could make. Judge Dupree nodded. This court will take a brief recess. We will reconvene for final remarks. The gavel came down, but no one moved for a moment. As the room emptied into the hallway, the crowd outside had grown. People who couldn't fit into the courtroom were now watching on screens. Local news vans were parked at every corner, and from stoops and porches nearby, longtime residents stood in their Sunday best, just watching quiet reverent. Word had gotten out. Not just about the arrest, but about what it had revealed. Calvin stepped into the hallway with his wife Dolores now by his side. She hadn't said much all morning, but her grip on his hand was firm. Steady. They're listening, she whispered. They are, he said, voice low. And that's good. It is. She looked up at him. But don't let it change who you are. I won't, he promised. It never has. Lieutenant Harris approached them, his expression tight but respectful. Judge Turner, he said quietly. I wanted you to know that Officer Hanley has been suspended, pending full investigation. Internal Affairs has opened a formal case. Calvin studied his face. That's a start? We'll do better, Harris said. Calvin gave a slow nod. You'll be watched. Harris didn't argue. He only nodded once and walked away. A few feet away, Drayton stood alone, staring at the floor. When he noticed Calvin looking his way, he didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stood like he was waiting for whatever came next, whether it was anger, forgiveness, or nothing at all. Calvin approached him. Officer Drayton, he said. Drayton looked up. Yes, sir? You had a choice in that moment. You froze. That's human, but you spoke today. That matters. Drayton swallowed hard. It doesn't change what I didn't do. No, Calvin replied. But it may change what you do next. Drayton nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Then Calvin turned back toward the courtroom doors, where the bailiff was already reopening the chambers. It was time. Time to end what had started on a quiet sidewalk with nothing but a pair of cuffs and a loaded assumption. As Calvin walked back to the defense table, he passed the prosecution. Sloan gave him a quiet look. Not pity, not sympathy, just acknowledgement. The kind only shared between people who understand how heavy the law can feel when it's misused, and how rare it is when it finally rights itself. Judge Dupree returned to the bench. The room settled. The gavel sounded once. This court will now hear closing remarks, she said. Calvin stood one last time. This wasn't just about what happened to me, he began. It was about what we allow to happen to each other when we look the other way, when we assume, when we rush, when we don't ask, who are you? But instead, ask, why are you here? He looked out at the room. I'm not here because I want a settlement or revenge. I'm here because we need to start drawing the line. Not between each other, but between right and wrong. And just like that, the truth settled across the courtroom, like the weight of justice itself. There's a moment in every courtroom just before the final word is spoken when the air thickens with consequence. No one breathes too loudly. No one shifts in their seat, because they all know something is about to change. That moment had arrived. Judge Dupree looked over the room. She was still centered, but her voice carried the weight of an entire community. This court has heard the facts, reviewed the footage, and listened to first-hand accounts. And while no official charge remains against Judge Turner, the greater matter at hand is one of trust. Trust in our officers, trust in our institutions, and trust in how we treat each other, especially those who've earned our respect long before they ever stepped into this courtroom. She turned toward Officer Hanley, seated at the far side of the room, staring at the floor like a man who'd finally realized the spotlight he once stood in had turned into a spotlight of exposure. "Officer Hanley," she said firmly, "you acted with prejudice. You escalated a peaceful encounter into an unlawful arrest. Your conduct was not only unprofessional, it was unconstitutional. This court recommends immediate administrative leave without pay, pending full internal investigation. Your badge does not grant you the right to bypass human dignity." Hanley didn't speak. His jaw clenched, but he remained silent. There was nothing left to say. Then she turned to Drayton. "Officer Drayton," the judge continued, "you failed to intervene when the law and your conscience should have compelled you. You admitted your mistake, and for that this court acknowledges your honesty. However, your silence enabled harm. This court recommends disciplinary review and mandatory bias training." Drayton nodded slowly. He had expected as much. There was no bitterness in his face, just the look of a man who had finally stepped out of denial. The courtroom remained hushed. No applause, no gasps, only the gravity of justice settling into place. Calvin remained seated, his hands folded, his face composed. He wasn't there for spectacle. He didn't need punishment to feel like justice had been served. He needed the truth acknowledged, and now it had been. Judge Dupree looked directly at him. "Judge Turner," she said, "this town owes you a debt of gratitude, not just for your service to the law, but for your example today. You've reminded us what it means to carry grace into rooms that don't deserve it, and strength into moments that demand it." Calvin stood gently nodding. "Thank you, Your Honor." She returned the nod, then brought the gavel down one final time. "This hearing is concluded." The sound echoed through the chamber like a bell, marking the end of an era. People began to rise. The atmosphere was heavy, but it wasn't sad. It felt necessary, like something that had long been buried had finally been unearthed, and now everyone had to live with what had been found. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Hundreds of people now lined along the sidewalk and courthouse steps, quiet and waiting. Not for a show, not for a headline, but to see with their own eyes that something had shifted. When Calvin stepped outside, the crowd parted, not with applause, but with respect. Some nodded, some pressed hands over their hearts, some whispered prayers beneath their breath. But they all understood what had just taken place wasn't about one man. It was about the soul of a community being tested. A few reporters moved forward, but Calvin gently raised a hand. He wasn't there to feed cameras. He was there to show what dignity looks like after it's been denied and reclaimed. Dolores joined him on the steps. She took his hand. He leaned in and whispered something in her ear. She smiled, tears in her eyes. She had seen him in robes on stages behind podiums. But this was different. This version of Calvin, standing tall after being torn down, was something sacred. Back inside the courthouse, Lieutenant Harris watched the crowd through the front windows. He didn't speak. He just stood there, quiet, thinking, reckoning. Behind him, officers moved slowly through the halls. Some shook their heads, some avoided eye contact, and a few just stood still, realizing that the badge over their heart had grown heavier overnight. Later that afternoon, Fredericksburg's mayor issued a formal public statement. He acknowledged the incident, promised reform, announced a plan to establish a civilian oversight board within 60 days. It was politics, sure, but it was something, a first step. That evening, local news stations ran the story on repeat footage of the arrest testimony from court, a brief clip of Calvin's statement. But it wasn't just the media talking. Neighbors were too, at kitchen tables, on porches, at barbershops, and church potlucks. They weren't just talking about racism. They were talking about responsibility. about courage, about what it means to speak up even when your voice shakes. And that kind of talk, it lingers longer than headlines. Meanwhile, in a quiet room at home, Calvin sat on his back porch, a steaming mug of tea in his hands. The sky above was streaked with lavender and orange, the day fading gently into dusk. Dolores sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, she asked, "Do you think it mattered?" He nodded. "Yes, even if just a little." She looked over. "You think it'll change anything?" "I think it already has." He took a sip, then added, "The real change doesn't happen in the courtroom. It happens in how we carry ourselves after the courtroom." And he was right, because somewhere tonight a young officer was rethinking how he saw the people he served. A neighbor who had never spoken out was drafting a letter to city council, and a child who watched the footage online was asking his father why a man like that got arrested for walking near a courthouse and why he had the strength to forgive the people who did it. That was the ripple. And Calvin, he didn't need credit for it. He just needed to know the water had finally moved. It had been nearly an hour since the courtroom emptied, but Judge Marilyn Dupree hadn't moved from her bench. The doors were closed now. The lights above had dimmed slightly with the afternoon sun, but she sat in silence, her hands resting on the polished wood eyes, fixed on the far wall, like she was still watching something unfold. Something that wasn't done with her yet. She had been on the bench for over 30 years, long enough to see laws rewritten, long enough to see old hatred dressed up in new uniforms, and long enough to know when something real had happened in her courtroom. And today it had. She finally stood slowly, deliberately. Each movement felt heavier than usual, not from age, but from understanding. From truth that had sat quietly in her courtroom for years, waiting for someone to speak it out loud. She walked back to her chambers and closed the door behind her. She didn't reach for a file or a robe or a glass of water. She reached for her recorder. She had something to say, and this time it wouldn't be hidden in legal language or buried under case law. "This is for the record." She began pressing the button. Her voice was steady, but laced with something raw. "What happened today will not go unspoken." She paused. "For decades we have told ourselves we are better, that progress has come, that the sins of our past are buried under time and policy and polite conversation. But today, a black man, an honored, decorated, and retired federal judge, was placed in handcuffs for walking while composed, walking while confident, walking while black." She took a breath longer this time. "I sat here today and watched a man who should never have had to defend his own dignity do so with more grace than most of us can summon. In a lifetime, I watched officers stumble over their lies. I watched fear, shame, and finally accountability. And I watched a community begin to wake up. Outside her chambers, the halls were beginning to quiet. Most of the reporters had cleared out. The gallery was empty, but Judge Dupree continued. "I have worn this robe for 33 years, and I tell you now, no piece of fabric, no title, and no office has ever taught me more about justice than what I saw in Calvin R. Turner today." She turned off the recorder and set it aside, knowing it would be added to the public transcript. Not just a legal record, but a moral one. Something to remain long after the headlines faded. Across town, in a modest meeting hall near the center of Fredericksburg, an emergency session was being held. The city council, shaken by the national media attention, had assembled to discuss policy reform oversight, and more importantly, how to respond to what had unfolded in plain sight. Council member Brenda Caldwell, a black woman in her 60s who had lived in the town her whole life, stood up first. "I don't want to talk about optics," she said bluntly. "I want to talk about consequences. Because for too long, men like Judge Turner have been the exception, not the rule, and even they get treated like criminals when the uniform doesn't see them clearly." The room was silent. "I want independent civilian oversight. Yes, but I also want mandatory community sessions. I want body cams that stay on, and I want every officer in this city to walk through the neighborhoods. They serve not in a patrol car, but on foot, shaking hands, learning names, seeing faces." The vote passed unanimously. It wasn't a revolution, but it was something real. Back at Calvin's house, the mood was quiet, reflective. Dolores had made tea like she always did. The house was calm. The phone had stopped ringing for a while, but there was something about the silence that didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Calvin sat in his study, the very same room where he'd once written opinions for federal cases that reshaped state law. Now the desk held only two things: a framed photo of his late father in uniform, and a letter. The letter had arrived that afternoon, hand-delivered, no return address. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed neat formal. It read, "Dear Judge Turner, I was in that courtroom today. I came expecting a routine hearing. I left understanding what justice actually looks like. Thank you for your strength, for your calm, for your refusal to meet hate with rage. I'm just a first-year law student, but today I remembered why I chose this path. Michael UVA Law." Calvin smiled. He placed the letter beside his father's photo and leaned back in his chair. Dolores walked in, watching him for a long moment. "You okay?" He nodded. "I'm tired, but not broken." She placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "You've done more than enough." He looked up at her. Not yet. Outside, the sky had turned to a deep indigo. Streetlights flickered on across the block. The world moved forward, slowly, cautiously, but forward nonetheless. Somewhere across town, Officer Drayton sat alone in his kitchen, rewatching the courtroom footage. Not out of self-pity, but out of responsibility. He rewound the moment he looked away, watched himself freeze, and then watched himself, hours later, finally speak. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that moment, standing on the witness stand telling the truth, was the beginning of his own change, his own accountability. In a different part of town, Hanley was doing the same, but not out of reflection, out of fear, out of the realization that for the first time in his career, there would be no hiding behind the badge, that his report was under full review, that his name would not be protected by silence. Justice had shown up wearing plain clothes and a leather briefcase, and now everyone had to live with that. Sometimes the ending doesn't come with applause. It comes in silence, in the way people sit with what they've seen and choose who they'll be the next day. It had been 3 weeks since the courtroom hearing. The news vans were long gone. The front-page headlines had been replaced by fresher scandals, new distractions. But for the people of Fredericksburg, the story hadn't ended. It had only begun. Change never starts with a parade. It starts with a pause. And people were finally pausing. At the police department, things didn't look the same anymore. Officer Hanley's desk sat empty, his badge turned in his future uncertain. The internal review had been completed, the recommendation termination. The town had rarely seen a case processed that fast, but no one called it rushed. They called it overdue. Hanley hadn't spoken publicly since the hearing. Rumors swirled that he'd left town. Others said he'd lawyered up. But Calvin never asked. He didn't need to know. Some lessons are meant to echo in the dark, not be broadcast for sympathy. Officer Drayton still wore the badge, but he wore it differently now, quietly, humbly. He had requested reassignment to foot patrol in the same neighborhoods he once drove past without a second thought. Some locals glared, some avoided him altogether, but a few nodded slowly, warily, as if to say, "We're watching, but we're also hoping." And that, Calvin had said once, is how real change begins. At the next town hall, Calvin was invited to speak, not as a victim, not even as a judge, but as a resident. He walked in without notes, stood before the microphone in his simple gray coat, and looked out at faces young and old, black and white officers and students. "My name is Calvin Raymond Turner," he said, voice steady. "You know my story now, but I didn't come here to retell it." He looked around. "I came here to remind us all that accountability is not revenge, it's responsibility. And without it, trust is just a slogan." The room was silent, listening. Some people asked me if I'd ever wear the robe again. The answer is no. I served my time on the bench. I made my rulings. But this? He gestured to the room. This is where the hard work begins. He stepped away from the mic and the crowd stood. Not because they had to, but because they understood. At home, Dolores watched from their porch as a group of teenagers walked by, arguing playfully about the case, the trial, the speech. One of them, a tall boy with thick glasses, turned to the others and said, "That guy made being calm look like power." Dolores smiled quietly. She knew the world wasn't fixed, but it was bending, just a little. In the weeks that followed, the town council kept its word. A civilian oversight committee was formed, diverse in age, race, profession, real citizens, real voices. Their first act requiring every officer in the department to re-attend training on constitutional rights, de-escalation, and implicit bias. Not as punishment, as a reset. Judge Dupree retired the following month. When asked why, she answered plainly, "I wanted to leave while the truth still echoed in these walls." On her final day, she left a note on her bench. Just one sentence scribbled on court stationery. "Justice is only real when it's uncomfortable." They framed it. Calvin never asked for recognition, but it found him anyway. Letters poured in, some from other judges, others from young students, veterans, even former inmates who said, "I've never trusted the law, but you made me want to." He responded to each one, slowly, carefully, in his own handwriting, because dignity, he believed, should never be rushed. One letter stood out. It was from the daughter of a man Calvin had once sentenced decades ago. She wrote, "You gave my father 10 years. He deserved it. But he always said, that judge didn't hate me. He just believed in something bigger than me. Thank you for still believing." The words stayed with him. And yet in all of this reform, recognition, respect, Calvin's life didn't change that much. He still walked the same path every Tuesday and Thursday morning, past the old church, past the courthouse, past the exact spot where it had all begun. But now people waved. Drivers slowed to nod. And kids walking to school didn't look through him. They looked at him. Some mornings he'd stop and speak to them, not to lecture, just to talk, to listen, to make sure they knew that calm didn't mean weak, and dignity didn't mean silence. He once told a young boy, "You don't have to raise your voice to raise your power." And the boy smiled like he'd just learned something no textbook could teach. The story of Calvin Turner didn't end in a courthouse. It didn't end in a news clip. It ended and began again, every time someone looked at a man like him and chose to see the years behind his eyes, see the peace in his posture, see the legacy in his silence. It's easy to miss people like Calvin. Easy to mistake calm for compliance, wisdom for weakness, and grace for passivity. But not anymore. Because after everything, after the arrest, the courtroom, the fallout, Calvin Turner never raised his voice. He raised the standard. And in a town once blind to its own reflection, that made all the difference. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't in shouting. It's in standing tall when the world tries to make you small. What we saw in Judge Calvin Turner's story wasn't just a legal mistake. It was a mirror held up to our society. It showed us how deeply bias can run even against those who've earned the highest honors. But more than that, it reminded us that dignity, patience, and truth still matter. For those of us who've lived through decades of change, hardship, and hard-won progress, this story speaks to something we know in our bones. Respect is earned not by force, but by how we carry ourselves in the face of injustice. Calvin didn't need to yell to be heard. His calm was his power. His wisdom was his protest. So what do we take from this? That it's never too late to hold people accountable. That silence can be a choice, but speaking up even quietly can shift an entire system. And most of all, that each of us, no matter our age or title, has a role to play in reminding the world what justice is supposed to look like. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your voice matters too.